Okay, and finally I want to talk a little bit about the style. And this is style that, is relevant to this story in particular, but is also relevant to Hemingway and the stories and novels that he's written. You're probably noticing that this is very spare. There's not a lot of detail, right? There's not a lot of anything other than the dialogue. We're not in characters' heads. There's not even a lot of description of setting. We have a little bit of that exposition in the first paragraph of the story, but everything else is just, the bare minimum of what we need. And that extends even to the idea of the operation, because the operation is not identified by name. And I imagine there's some frustration among you guys in class, wondering like, why the heck would he just not come out and say and call it an abortion, right? What's the big deal? Why not go ahead and do that? And maybe you think that he's deliberately trying to be a pain in the ass or something. But I don't think that's really the case. And what's interesting about Hemingway is he wrote sort of according to this iceberg theory that he developed. And I'm going to read a little passage explaining that for you. So this is, Hemingway explaining his writing process. I always try to write on the principle of the iceberg. There are 7/8 of it underwater for every part that shows. Anything you can eliminate, and it only strengthens your iceberg. It is the part that doesn't show. So I think, Hemingway is a good writer, not just because of the prose that he uses and the way that he writes, but it's also what he chooses to include or not include. And maybe you're thinking, okay, but why not just make the reader's life easier and acknowledge that the operation is an abortion? And I think there are a couple of reasons. One, it sort of adds to the tension of the story, right? Maybe it makes it difficult to figure out at the beginning, but I think we can figure it out. And two, that's not so unreasonable. These things happen a lot in life, right? I don't want to, creep anybody out, but maybe if you think about, there are situations where we try to talk about something without talking about it explicitly, right? And I'm thinking about maybe, anytime your parents had to sit down and talk to you about sex for the first time, right? Were they using euphemisms? Were they being very explicit? I imagine some of them were not, and they were trying to dodge around the topic as much as possible. And I think that's a natural human instinct, right? Is to, in this story, they're trying to talk about a thing without talking about the thing. And I have a son who's going to be born at the beginning of July, and at some point we'll have to have the talk with him, and I imagine that will be a very uncomfortable situation to have. Just like the conversation in this story is a little bit uncomfortable. So I think that, part of this is the iceberg theory, but part of it is also just the way that humans deal with problems. And by not talking about the abortion, it's a way of, avoiding the topic. Obviously, they're not avoiding it because they're talking about it, but by not using the word, they are avoiding it. So I think that explains a little bit of why we don't have the operation listed by name. And it also begins to explain why the prose, the actual writing, is so minimalist, right? And maybe you wouldn't apply that term to all of Hemingway, but this story seems to have just what is necessary, right? Basically, it's just the eavesdrop. It's the characters talking to each other. It's the brief introduction of the setting, and that's about it. And I think that's because Hemingway trusts us as readers to sort of fill in the gaps of what's going on. This is kind of off topic and on the fly. I don't have any notes for this. But I've been reading this book of criticism by Paul Auster. I think I just finished it. So it's here on my bookshelf. So a book of criticism by Paul Auster. It's called The Art of Hunger. And he writes novels, and he's written some memoir and things like that. He talks about the way that he writes novels versus the way that other people write novels. And he writes novels not with a whole bunch of detail describing the room, what type of wood there is. If I pick this up, should I do that? I might never get back into this. But if we scan around the room, I have my bookshelf over there. We could go and examine what type of wood it is. We could examine this bookshelf where, these are my criticism books, my pens, the little figurines. So there are novelists who will choose to include all of those types of details, and then there are novelists that don't. And Paul Auster was explaining in this book that he doesn't do that because the human imagination wants to be able to fill in some of those gaps. So as long as we have the scaffolding to get us the actual bones of the story, we're going to be able to fill in a lot of the gaps, right? And so I think Hemingway works a lot in the same way, where he gives you what you need, and then he lets you, the reader, experience the story in your own way. And he doesn't dictate that, the world has to look my way. He allows the reader to, bring him or herself into the story and sort of populate things. I mean, that's, if any of you like to read and you're in an intro to lit class, so maybe you do, you probably like to read because of the imaginative side of it, right? Because you get to populate the world in your own way. And some authors give you more details than others, but it's the idea of building your own world. I mean, we're all reading the same stories, right? But when we, especially The Village, like I have a very vivid image of what The Village is like in The Lottery, and it's probably very different than the images that you all have. And if you think about that setting, we know what's happening in the story, but The Village isn't really described. We don't know what the courthouse looks like. We don't really know. I think we described Mr. Summers a little bit, but a lot of key details about people are missing. I forget who said this. This was in another piece of criticism, but one author was talking about how he's written entire novels where the characters don't have noses or ears or faces because those are things that he never chooses to talk about. There's a character there, but then and they have sort of a presence, but it's the reader's reader's inclination to fill in those gaps and sort of create the persona of the characters however they want. They can look however the reader wants them to look. And so I think that's kind of what we're getting at when we talk about the iceberg theory. I don't think Hemingway's just trying to be a jerk and say, I'm going to write the story that all these literature students are going to be confused by when they read it. I think that there is enough in the story, if you really take a look at it, to figure out that they are talking about an abortion. And I think that's, it's not just him being difficult as an author. I think that's something that we do in life, right? I mean, you all probably have, if you're in relationships, you have problems, and do you ever have times where you talk about the problem without actually talking about the problem? All of a sudden you get really pissed off because somebody didn't do the dishes, and you're not pissed off about the dishes, you're pissed off about something else, right? But you don't say that you're pissed off about that other thing. And I think that's kind of a manifestation of what's going on in the story. I know I went off on a bunch of different tangents here. You're lucky that you don't have me in a face-to-face class because I would be all over the place. So I hope you'll forgive me for that. But I just wanted to, I wanted to fill you in on Hemingway's attitude toward his own writing, this idea of the iceberg, and giving you what you need and letting you imagine, the rest of the iceberg that's under the water that you don't get to see immediately.